Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We move to the Kitab al-Wasiyyah, the book of the Wasiyyah or Bequest. Wasiyyah in the language means to give an important order or an order about an important matter. As in the statement of Allah Jalla wa Ala in Surah An-Nisa, وَلَقَدْ وَصَّيْنَا الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ وَإِيَّاكُمْ أَنِ اتَّقُوا اللَّهَ. We have given the Wasiyyah to those who have been given the book and to your own selves to fear Allah. So this is an order about an important matter, and you cannot get more important and vital than fearing Allah. As for the technical meaning in the fiqh, then it is to give a donation of part of your wealth after your death, or it is to give an order to somebody to carry out a particular task after your death. So an example of this wakala after your death would be that you order somebody to look after my children after my death. This has nothing to do with giving charity from your wealth, but it is ordering somebody to do something on your behalf after your death, because obviously after you die you will not be able to look after your children. The ahkam of the wasiyyah can take all 5 ahkam: muharram, makruh, mubah, mustahab and wajib. An important question arises: can you give a wasiyyah to those relatives of yours who will not inherit from you? Because we know you do not give a wasiyyah to those inheritors because they're going to receive the inheritance. But some of your relatives may not receive inheritance. For example, your brother. He will not receive inheritance in the presence of the father. So can you give a wasiyyah to your brother in a case like this? Some ulama, like Ibn Abbas, say it is wajib to do so. What's the evidence? In Surah Al-Baqarah, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمْ إِذَا حَضَرَ أحدكم الموت إن ترك خيرا الوصية للوالدين والأقربين بالمعروف حقا على المتقين. It is prescribed for you that when death approaches one of you and he has some wealth which he leaves behind, then he should give a bequest to the parents and to the near relatives on a reasonable basis as a right against the muttaqeen. So if it is a right against the muttaqeen, then it has to be wajib. Likewise, the ayah says kutiba, it is ordained. So it gives the idea that it is wajib for you. Of course, the ayah that you have heard speaks about the parents. Now the ayat of inheritance make the exception. So you do not give a bequest to your parents because your parents will always inherit from you. But that leaves us with the aqrabin, which the ayah speaks about, the near kindred. These are the ones who will not inherit from you, but they are closely related to you. What appears from this ayah is that it is obligatory to leave a bequest for them. However, the Jumhur, most of the scholars say it is not obligatory. The majority say that that ayah of Surah Al-Baqarah is abrogated by the ayat of the inheritance in Surah An-Nisa. But this is not a good opinion to hold. This ayah of Surah Al-Baqarah, and it is ayah number 180, is not abrogated, rather a takhsis is made to this ayah. That is different from a complete abrogation. A takhsis simply abrogates certain elements of the generality. So in this case, a takhsis has been made to the parents, but that leaves the ruling open for the aqrabin, the close near relatives. The Jumhur also use as an evidence this current hadith of the chapter. Let us just quote it right now. From Ibn Umar, the Prophet ﷺ said, مَا حَقُّ امْرِئٍ مُسْلِمٍ لَهُ شَيْءٌ يُرِيدُ أَنْ يُوصِيَ فِيهِ يَبِيتُ لَيْلَتَيْنِ إِلَّا وَوَصِيَّتُهُ مَكْتُوبَةٌ عِنْدَهُ. It is a duty for a Muslim who has some wealth which he wants to give as a bequest to spend even 2 nights, except that the bequest should be written with him. They say that the Prophet says that this person has wealth which he wants to leave as a bequest. So if you want to do something, then it can also be that you do not want to do something, because the want can go either way. You want to or you do not want to. So therefore you have a choice, and hence it is not obligatory to give a bequest to the near kindred, because you may want to, but you may also not want to. However, this type of istidlal, or using an evidence for a ruling, this type is not acceptable, because just because you want to do something does not mean it is not obligatory. For example, if you are told, if you want to perform the salah, then you must make wudu. Does that now mean that the salah is not obligatory? No one's going to say that the salah is not obligatory, yet that sentence makes complete sense. So it cannot be inferred from this hadith that the wasiyyah is optional. It's a similar case with the hadith of the udhiyah. إذا دخل ذو الحجة وأراد أحدكم أن يضحي فليمسك عن أظفاره وشعره. When the Dhul Hijjah enters and one of you wants to make a sacrifice, then let him refrain from cutting his nails and his hair. Most scholars say that the udhiyah is not wajib because the hadith says he wants to perform the sacrifice, which could mean that he may not want to perform the sacrifice. But again, we say the same thing. This type of istidlal is not correct. Just because you want to do something does not mean it is not obligatory. The ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah says, إِن تَرَكَ خَيْرًا الْوَصِيَّةِ. If he leaves khayr. Now khayr is not just merely wealth, rather khayr is much wealth. So if you leave much wealth, then yes, according to the opinion of Ibn Abbas and those who follow him, it is obligatory to leave a bequest to the near kindred. What reason could there be to leave a bequest for the near kindred? Because they will be affected by the death of their beloved relative. So it makes sense to leave them behind something to keep that connection after death. We take from this hadith that today's work, you do it today. Do not leave it for tomorrow. And we take that your wasiyyah should be written down, signed and dated. Now it needs to be noted that if you have a debt to pay off and there's no evidence that you owe the debt, then it is obligatory upon you to write this wasiyyah, because if you do not, then how will your creditor prove that you owe him a debt? And if he cannot do so and cannot take his money back, then his rights will be infringed upon, and that is impermissible. The next chapter is about a wasiyyah from a third of your wealth. Amir ibn Sa'd reports from his father, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, who says that the Messenger of Allah visited me in my illness, which brought me near to death in the year of the Hajjatul Wada'. He said, Ya Rasulullah, balaghani ma tara min al-waj'. O Messenger of Allah, you can see the pain that has reached me. Wa ana dhu mal, and I have much wealth. Wa la yarithuni illa ibnatun li wahida. And only one daughter of mine is going to inherit from me. أَفَأَتَصَدَّقُ بِثُلُثَيْ مَالِي. Can I give a sadaqah of 2/3 of my wealth? The Prophet said no. He then asked, أَفَأَتَصَدَّقُ بِالشَّطْرِ. Can I give a half of my wealth? The Prophet said no. الثُّلُث وَالثُّلُثُ كَثِيرٌ. Rather you should give a third, but even a third is much. إِنَّكَ أَن تَذَرَ وَرَثَتَكَ أَغْنِيَاءَ خَيْرٌ مِنْ أَن تَذَرَهُمْ عَالَةً يَتَكَفَّفُونَ النَّاسِ. That you should leave your inheritors rich is better than to leave them poor, begging the people. وَلَسْتَ تُنْفِقُ نَفَقَةً تَبْتَغِي بِهَا وَجْهَ اللَّهِ إِلَّا أُجِرْتَ بِهَا. And you will not spend anything seeking the face of Allah except you will be rewarded for it. حَتَّى اللُّقْمَةُ تَجْعَلُهَا فِي امْرَأَتِكَ. Even the morsel of food which you put in the mouth of your wife. Then Sa'ad asked the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, أُخَلَّفُ بَعْدَ أَصْحَابِي. O Messenger of Allah, will I stay behind in Mecca after my companions have left for Al-Madinah? The Prophet said, إِنَّكَ لَن تُخَلَّفَ فَتَعْمَلَ عَمَلًا تَبْتَغِي بِهِ وَجْهَ اللَّهِ إِلَّا ازْدَدْتَ بِهِ دَرَجَةً وَرِفْعَةً. Even if you get left behind and then you do deeds by which you seek the face of Allah, you would increase in grades and highness. He said, وَلَعَلَّكَ تُخَلَّفُ حَتَّى يُنْفَعَ بِكَ أَقْوَامٌ وَيُضَرَّ بِكَ آخَرُونَ. And perhaps you're going to survive your companions, such that some people will be benefited by you and others will be harmed by you. He goes on to say, اللهم أمضي لأصحابي هجرتهم ولا تردهم على أعقابهم. O Allah, complete the hijrah of my companions and do not make them turn back on their heels, meaning into kufr. ولكن البائس سعد بن خولة. But rather the wretched one is Sa'd ibn Khawla. And the narrator says that the Prophet felt grief for Sa'd ibn Khawla because he died in Mecca, despite having made hijrah from Mecca to Al-Madinah. He died in Mecca in the year 10th Hijri. We take a number of benefits from this hadith. We take that if you have inheritors, then you're not allowed to give more than 1/3 of your wealth as a bequest, because 1/3 is a big portion and a big fraction. And if you leave more than 1/3 as a bequest, it will harm your inheritors because they will receive much less than they ought to. Of course, if they give permission for you to give more than 1/3, then that is their right which they can drop. We take the virtue of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas in his desire to seek knowledge in order to implement it. And every time we find a Sahabi asking a question to the Prophet, this is a fadila or a virtue of that companion. Why? Because it means he's eager for knowledge in order to implement it, and this is a positive quality. The Prophet gave the upper limit of a third. Ibn Abbas prefers a quarter, because the Prophet said a third, but a third is much. Abu Bakr gave a wasiyyah of a fifth, which is the same fraction taken from the war booty given to Allah and the Messenger. So basically the third is an absolute maximum, and it is better to go below it. We also find that when you perform an action seeking the face of Allah Jalla wa Ala, thereby you are rewarded for it, and Allah does not waste your action as long as you had ikhlas and you did it in accordance with the sunnah. إِنَّمَا يَتَقَبَّلُ اللَّهُ مِنَ الْمُتَّقِينَ. Allah only accepts from the muttaqeen, and to be a muttaqi you need to perform your righteous action with ikhlas and in accordance with the sunnah. Even feeding your wife is a reward-worthy action. But if your intention is to seek the face of Allah Jalla wa Ala, then it is yet more reward-worthy. We also find that if you perform a righteous action seeking the face of Allah Jalla wa Ala, then it will increase you in your grade with Allah Jalla wa Ala and in your prestige. And the Prophet made dua for his companions, may they complete their hijrah, that is to say, return from Mecca to Al-Madinah. Remember, this hadith is happening during the time of the Hajjatul Wada', that is the 10th year. And he says, do not let them turn back on their heels, that is to say, go back to kufr. But the Prophet says that the one of the miserable fortune is Sa'd ibn Khawla, because he died in Mecca in the year 10th Hijri, despite having made hijrah from Mecca to Al-Madinah. And that is most unfortunate, to die in a place you left for the sake of Allah. Because when you leave something for the sake of Allah, you do not want to see it again. When you leave it for the sake of Allah, you don't want to return back to it. So how about actually dying in it? However, we do not say that the hijrah of Sa'd ibn Khawla radiyallahu anh became null and void, because death is not in your hands. وَلَا تَدْرِ نَفْسٌ بِأَيِّ أَرْضٍ تَمُوتُ. No soul knows in what land it will die. And so we find here the Prophet ﷺ feeling sorry for Sa'd ibn Khawla. We can also take from this hadith that you should visit the ill. And by ill we mean somebody who is bedridden and cannot go out into the community. We find in the hadith the Prophet said that perhaps you will survive your companions. And that's exactly what happened. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas is in an illness from which he fears death. He's talking about inheritance and bequests. Yet he actually recovers from this illness and goes on to live a long life, in which indeed he does benefit many people, as he conquered lands and made the word of Allah Jalla wa Ala superior, and he harmed many other people, meaning to say the enemies of Islam. At that time of the hadith he just had one daughter, but in the future Allah Jalla wa Ala granted him many sons and daughters. We also take that you should consult people of knowledge and those whose knowledge you trust, and people of taqwa, just as Sa'd did to the Prophet here. We also take that when you give a ruling, give the reason as well, just as the Prophet did. He said that you should leave your inheritors rich. It is better than leaving them poor, begging of the people. We also find that begging of the people is not praised. And if you ask people just to increase your wealth and you don't have any particular necessary need to ask, then you are actually asking people for hot coals. As the Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith in Sahih Muslim, مَنْ سَأَلَ النَّاسَ أَمْوَالَهُمْ تَكَثُّرًا فَإِنَّمَا يَسْأَلُ جَمْرًا فَلْيَسْتَقِلَّ أَوْ لِيَسْتَكْثِرْ. Whoever asks people just to hoard up wealth, then he is actually asking for hot coals, so let him ask little or much. So asking people where there is no need is not permitted, and nowadays you find this Batil Halloween celebration in which kids are encouraged to go around knocking on people's doors, asking them for things, be it wealth or food or whatever else. This is haram, no doubt about it. It falls under this hadith. Also, just on an aqidah point, the hadith mentions seeking the face of Allah. This face is a literal face of Allah Jalla wa Ala, which befits Him, which does not resemble any other face. And we do not translate the word face into pleasure, because the word pleasure is rida or marda, which is not the same as wajh, which means face. We also find from the hadith the fear of the Sahaba of being left behind in a land from which they made hijrah, because Sa'ad asked, Ya Rasulullah, أُخَلَّفُ بَعْدَ أَصْحَابِي, O Messenger of Allah, will I be left behind after my Sahaba, meaning left behind in this land, meaning the land of Makkah, because he did not want to be left behind in Makkah, because he made hijrah from Makkah. Whatever you leave for the sake of Allah, you do not want to return back to it. And we already took the hadith of Umar ibn al-Khattab when he gave a horse in the way of Allah and he wanted to purchase it back. The Prophet said, إِنَّ الْعَائِدَ فِي صَدَقَتِهِ كَالْكَلْبِ يَعُودُ فِي قَيْئِهِ. The one who returns back to his sadaqah is like a dog who returns back to his vomit. Why? Because you left it for the sake of Allah. Do not return back to it then. Where the Prophet told Sa'ad that even if you are left behind and you do an action seeking the face of Allah, it will raise you in daraja and rif'ah, in grades and prestige. So it will not have an effect on your actions. Wherever you perform righteous actions, you will be rewarded for it. We take from the hadith that you make dua for your brothers. The Prophet ﷺ made dua for his companions, make them complete their hijrah. So let them leave Mecca and return back to Al-Madinah. We find here the Prophet is in need of Allah Jalla wa'ala his own self. So he has no share in Ar-Rububiyyah. Okay, let's just finish this chapter off with one question. If we go by the opinion that giving a wasiyyah to your near kindred who are not inheritors is wajib, but a person does not do so and then he dies, is it upon the inheritors to give a portion of the wealth to the near kindred? The answer is no. Upon this opinion of Ibn Abbas, the deceased would be sinful for not leaving a bequest to the near kindred who are not inheritors, but it is not upon the inheritors to give from their own share to that near kindred. Let us move to the next chapter about sending the reward of a good action to the deceased. From Aisha radiallahu anha, she says that a man came to the Prophet. He said, "Inna ummi ftulitat nafsuha wa lam tusi wa adhunnuha law takallamat tasaddaqat afalaha ajrun in tasaddaqtu anha?" Qala na'am. The man said, "My mother passed away suddenly and she did not leave a bequest, and I think that if she could speak, she would give sadaqah. So, would she have any reward if I give sadaqah on her behalf?" And the Prophet said yes. And in another wording, the man asks, "Fali ajrun an atasaddaqa anha?" Will I have reward if I give charity on her behalf? We take immediately from the hadith that giving a charity on behalf of the deceased will reward them. And this is just a normal charity. So what about completing an obligatory duty on their behalf? Such as, for example, if somebody wanted to perform the Hajj, he was ready to do so, but before Dhul Hijjah came, he died. So if somebody fulfills that Hajj on his behalf, that definitely will benefit. Because if just a normal charity would benefit, then how about a wajib action? However, the more interesting question here is that, do we say it is a recognized and established sunnah of the Prophet to give charity on behalf of the deceased to benefit them? The answer here is no. It is not sunnah, but it is permissible. And the evidence for its permissibility is this hadith. So one might ask, well, what's the sunnah then? The sunnah is given in the hadith in the Sahih. When a person dies, all his actions are cut off except for three things: an ongoing charity, or beneficial knowledge which he leaves behind, or a righteous son who makes dua for him. These are the three matters which will benefit the deceased. Notice what he did not mention in the hadith. He did not mention giving charity on behalf of the deceased, or praying, or fasting, or performing Hajj and Umrah, and so on. So what the Prophet did not mention is just as important as what he did mention. Notice that. Here's a question. If a person knows he has to pay zakah, and he died before paying the zakah, and he did not even intend to pay the zakah, and we can say the same thing with the Hajj as well. He did not even intend to perform the Hajj, despite having the means to do so. Then when such a person dies, can we pay from his wealth the zakah, and would it benefit him? And likewise, can we perform Hajj on his behalf, and would it benefit him? Well, with regards to the Hajj, the answer is easy. No, you do not perform it on his behalf, and no, even if you did, it will not benefit him. Why? Because your actions are by your intention, and you will have what you intend. Did this man intend the Hajj? No. Therefore, he cannot have the reward of the Hajj simply because he did not intend it. Yes, it's different. If he did intend the Hajj and he died before, then yes, you can perform it on his behalf. And we have plenty of evidence for that. What about the zakah? Well, you have to give from his wealth the zakah because this is not only the right of Allah Jalla wa'ala, but it is also the right of the poor people. So just like if you owe a debt to somebody else and you die before having paid it off, it must be paid off on your behalf. And so likewise then the zakah, because it's a right of another person and it must be fulfilled. However, having said that, it will not benefit the deceased. For the same reason, he did not intend to give the zakah, so how can the reward of the zakah reach him when he did not even intend it? You can also take from the hadith that you're allowed to go by your dhann, that which you think more likely to be correct, but you are not 100% sure, because the man said, I think if she could speak, she would give sadaqah. And so you are allowed to act upon the dhann. Now, an interesting question here is that if this man gives the sadaqah on behalf of the mother, one of the wording of the hadith says, will I have a reward if I give sadaqah on her behalf? And as you've heard, the other narration says, will she have the reward if I give sadaqah on her behalf? Well, both are correct. The man and his mother will receive reward. However, the mother receives the reward of the sadaqah, but the man does not receive the reward of a sadaqah. Rather, he receives the reward of ihsan, doing good to another person, and being dutiful to his mother, because it is from birr that you send reward or benefit your mother after she passes away. So this man would have the reward of ihsan and birr, not of a sadaqah. So that is an interesting note. However, there still remains a problem between the two narrations, one which says, will I have reward, and the other one which says, will she have reward, because the narration is one and the same. We're talking about the same instance, and it seems very unlikely that this man would have asked, will I have reward and will she have reward? And even if he did ask that, it ought to have been narrated in this way. But we find one narration says, will I have reward, and the other one says, will she have reward? It appears he only asked one question, but which one was it? So it appears that a possibility is that one of the narrators has made a mistake with the wording, and so the wording which is the mistaken one will be shadh, and the correct wording will be mahfuz, to use the technical terms. Let's move on to the next section about the reward of a deceased person after his death. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, إِذَا مَاتَ الْإِنسَانُ انقطع عنه عمله إلا من ثلاثة إلا من صدقة جارية أو علم ينتفع به أو ولد صالح يدعو له. When a person dies, all his actions are cut off except from three. Number one, from an ongoing charity. Number two, from beneficial knowledge which he leaves behind. And number three, from a righteous son who makes dua for him. So what about this ongoing charity? Well, let us say you pay to build a masjid, or a school, or a hospital, or a well. Something which will go on and on. So something which is not just immediately consumable like bread or some other food stuff. Something which will go on and on benefiting the people. This also includes a waqf as well. When you leave behind something that will go on and on being used after your death. You could leave your house behind as a waqf to be made into a masjid, for example. So that would come under this hadith. What about beneficial knowledge? So the most beneficial knowledge is the knowledge of the sharia, in terms of the aqidah and fiqh. And also that which will enable you to learn this, which would be the Arabic knowledge as well. And there is no problem in including worldly knowledge which benefits people also. As the Prophet said, خَيْرُكُمْ أَنْفَعُكُمْ لِلنَّاسِ. The best of you is the one who is most beneficial to the people. And that includes all types of benefits, shar'i or otherwise, as long as it's a genuine benefit. And also a righteous son who will make dua for you. So this includes a daughter as well, because walad includes males and females. And merely making dua for your parents is a sign that you are righteous. So the birrul walidain actually goes on even after their death as well. As you make dua for them, you are doing birr. What about someone who is not the child? If such a person makes dua, would that benefit the deceased? The answer is yes. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَالَّذِينَ جَاءُوا مِن بَعْدِهِمْ يَقُولُونَ رَبَّنَا اغْفِرْ لَنَا وَلِإِخْوَانِنَا الَّذِينَ سَبَقُونَا بِالْإِيمَانِ. And those who came after them, they said, our Rabb, forgive us and our brothers who came before us. So these are not the children who are making dua, these are Muslims making dua for their fellow Muslims. And from this hadith we can give an advice. You do not need to be a scholar to leave behind beneficial knowledge, because that's what some people may be thinking. Rather, any knowledge that you have, convey it and teach it to others. Even if it is one hadith that you know, as long as you know it is authentic, then convey it. Even if you know of a weak hadith, then inform the people that this hadith is weak, and which scholars have graded it to be weak. That is still beneficial knowledge. So anything you have, convey it, because that might be the one piece of knowledge which will make the difference for you after your death. Also note from this hadith that the deceased cannot make dua for the living, because some of the living people, they ask the deceased to make dua for them. This hadith proves to us that the deceased cannot make dua for the living, because the hadith tells us that their actions are cut off, and dua is from the actions, and your actions are cut off. Therefore the deceased cannot make dua for the living. The living can make dua for the living, sure, but not the deceased. Making dua for your brother certainly benefits you, and all benefit of the deceased is cut off except for these 3 actions that are named. And so what is not mentioned is that the deceased makes dua for the living. So do not be fooled by those people who will try to convince you that asking the deceased to make dua for you is the same as asking the living to make dua for you. And they try to make that analogy. That analogy is batil. And calling upon the deceased is shirk. The analogy which would work is calling upon the deceased to make dua for you would be analogous to the mushrikeen worshipping their idols. That analogy is closer than the analogy that the people who follow falsehood give. Why? Because in both cases you are calling upon someone or something that is unable to hear you nor respond to your dua. So even if they could hear you, they could not respond to your dua. And this is what is in common between the deceased and the conventional idols that people worship. Let's move to the next chapter about the waqf. Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu reports that his father Umar gained some property after the Battle of Khaybar. He sought the advice of the Prophet, and he said that I have acquired land in Khaybar, and I have never acquired property more valuable than that to me. What do you command me to do with it? And the Prophet said, if you like, you can keep the actual land intact and give its produce as charity. So he says that Umar radiallahu anhu gave the produce as charity, declaring that the land must not be sold, nor inherited, nor donated. And he devoted its produce to the poor, to the nearest kin, to emancipate the servants, and in the way of Allah, and to the wayfarers, and to the guests. There is no sin for the one who is in charge of it to eat from it in a reasonable manner, or to feed his friends, as long as he does not hoard up the goods for himself. That is, hoarding it up with a view to becoming rich. So this is the main narration when it comes to the waqf. And waqf literally in the language means to stop or to restrain, but technically in the fiqh it means to keep the actual item of wealth, but its benefit can be used or enjoyed by the people. So in our case, we have a land. You keep the land as it is. Nobody owns the land, but the crops which grow from the land, people are able to benefit from that. And this hadith informs us of the first waqf given by anyone in Al-Islam. Khaybar is a land about 100 miles northwest of Al-Madinah. It is a land of agriculture which was populated by the Yahud, who came from Asham, and they settled in Al-Madinah and around it, because they knew a prophet was going to come to Al-Madinah. They thought this prophet would be from Bani Israel. Of course, it turns out that he is from the Arab, and so they belied him. We find here that Umar asks the advice of the Prophet. He wants to do something beneficial with this valuable wealth of his, and Allah Jalla wa Ala says, لَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ حَتَّى تُنْفِقُوا مِمَّا تُحِبُّونَ. You will not attain al-birr until you spend out of that which you love. Not out of that which you hate, but out of that which you love. And this land was the most beloved to Umar radiallahu anhu. And this land, or whatever the property you want to give in as a waqf, is not allowed to be sold. لا يباع ولا يورث ولا يوهب. It is not sold, it is not inherited, and it is not to be given as a gift. Rather, it stays for its purpose. So you can get to own something out of force, where you do not have a choice, and this would be inheritance. The inheritance wealth comes your way whether you like it or not. Or you can get to own something where you do have a choice, and in that case, you either have to pay for it, as in a sales contract, or you do not have to pay for it, as in a gift. But in both of the cases, you have a choice to take ownership, as long as it's by mutual consent, of course. But in inheritance, you do not have the choice. It comes your way whether you like it or not. So this waqf then, the ownership cannot be transferred. It is much like a servant being freed. You are not allowed to take him back into servitude after freeing him. this freedom of his becomes binding. Because of course, you're not allowed to just take a free person into servitude. And so likewise is the waqf. It's as if you freed it for the sake of Allah Jalla wa'ala. You're not allowed to take it back into bondage now. However, you are allowed to change it for that which is better than it and will serve a better purpose. So a masjid, for example, is becoming decrepit and does not really serve its purpose. So you're allowed to sell this building, let's say, and with the money purchase another building which will serve a better purpose as a masjid. So that you can do because you're going from worse to better. So Umar said that the produce will be benefited by the poor people, and these are those who do not have enough to feed themselves and their family. The qurba and the near kindred, as giving charity to your near kindred, is double-fold reward. First is a charity, and second is joining ties of kinship. Also, fir riqab literally means for the neck, and this is to free a servant. So, for example, it could be used to help a mukatab pay for his freedom, or perhaps just to purchase a servant and then free him. And as for wafi sabilillah, in the way of Allah, this refers to fighting in the way of Allah. And ibn sabil, this is the wayfarer who has been cut off from his homeland. Now he might be rich, but as long as he's cut off from his homeland and does not have enough money to reach his homeland, then he is an ibn sabil, and he's given enough to make him return to his land. Wad-daif, the guest, this is the person coming from outside the land and he stays for a short while. And Umar also says that the one who's looking after this land is allowed to eat from it on a reasonable basis. We know that his daughter Hafsa was the one looking after this land, and the one looking after the waqf can also feed his friends from it, again on reasonable terms. We can take a valuable lesson that you should seek the advice of people of knowledge, just as Umar did here with the Prophet. And this makes sense because another person may be able to see something advantageous that you are unable to see. Here's a question: what if the muqif, the one giving the waqf, makes a condition that you are allowed to sell the item, be it a land or a house or whatever? Well, we say if he makes this condition, then this condition is batil and is not to be respected. Unless he says you can sell it if the benefits are no longer being accrued. In that case, it can be sold to be replaced by something which will serve the purpose, like we said before. And like we said before, giving a waqf is very much like freeing a servant. You cannot now, after having freed him, take him back into bondage. And so selling a waqf on just like that, without any need, without replacing it, will be like bringing the servant back into bondage after you have freed him. And that is wrong and impermissible. We learn that it is very much desirable not to give a waqf specifically for your own children or near kindred, but rather give the waqf for the benefit of the general people, just as Umar did here. And we learn that the one giving a waqf can make conditions. We can also take that there is no problem in using the customs of your people as a yardstick to measure what is reasonable and what is unreasonable, because Umar said that the nadir of the waqf can take from the produce of the land on reasonable terms. What does reasonable mean? Well, this will be decided by the customs of the people. Let us move to the next chapter about the one who does not have anything to leave behind, does not leave behind a bequest. Talha ibn Musarrif reports that he asked Abdullah ibn Abi Awfa radiallahu an, who was a companion of the Prophet. So Talha asked him, did the Prophet leave behind a bequest? Did he make a wasiyyah? He replied, no. Then Talha asked him, why are the Muslims ordered to make a wasiyyah then? And Abdullah ibn Abi Awfa replied, Awsa bi kitabillah. The Prophet gave a wasiyyah with the book of Allah. You will remember what a wasiyyah is. It is one of two matters. Either you leave behind some charity for someone after your death, so you designate this charity to somebody after your death, or it is that you give an order to be carried out after your death. So when Abdullah ibn Abi Awfa was asked, did the Prophet leave behind a bequest? He answered no. That is to say, the Prophet did not designate any particular charity to anyone. Rather, all the wealth which the Prophets leave behind, all Prophets, it is given as charity to people. So the prophets are not inherited from. But then Talha asked, why are the Muslims then ordered to leave behind a bequest where the Prophet himself did not leave a bequest? And then Abdullah ibn Abi Awfa replied that he left behind a bequest or a wasiyyah ordering people to stick to the book of Allah Jalla wa Ala. So it is not a donation type of bequest, but rather it is a bequest which is an order to perform a particular act. And this act that we're talking about here, in our case, is adhering to the book of Allah Jalla wa Ala. During the time of Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anh, there were rumors going around that the Prophet left the Khilafah for Ali radiallahu anh. And this is a lie which Ali radiallahu anh himself rejected when he was asked in Sahih al-Bukhari, did the Prophet leave behind anything or order anything to be done? And Ali said, no, except the book of Allah and the understanding which Allah gives to a person about the book of Allah Jalla wa Ala, which is the Quran, and also what is in this parchment. And he was asked, what is in this parchment? He said, al-aql, which is the blood money, wa fikakul asir, that the prisoner needs to be freed, wa alla yuqtala muslimun bi kafir, and that a Muslim is not to be killed for a kafir in a qisas situation. So you'll notice what is not mentioned is that Ali should be made the Khalifa after the Prophet. That is not mentioned. This is vital because that was the rumor spreading around. The Prophet ﷺ said, Inna ma'ashara al-anbiya la nurathu ma tarakna sadaqa. We, group of prophets, are not inherited from. That is, no wealth of ours is inherited. Anything which we do leave behind is just a general charity for the people. And so Fatima radiallahu anha, his daughter, did not inherit anything from him. And on the topic of making a wasiyyah to Ali radiallahu anhu, let's take this narration in the chapter. From Al-Aswad ibn Yazid, he says that the people mentioned to Aisha that a wasiyyah was made to Ali, and she replied to this by saying, when did the Prophet make a wasiyyah for him? She says, during his deathbed, the Prophet was resting against my chest. She says, he asked for a tray when he fell in my lap, and I did not even realize that he had passed away. So at which point in time then did he give a wasiyyah for Ali? So in this narration, Aisha is saying that, look, he passed away right in front of me, on my lap, and at no point in time did he give a wasiyyah for Ali radiallahu anhu. Now it needs to be noted that in this narration, Aisha is being asked about the Prophet giving a wasiyyah right before his death. And this is what her answer is directed to. The times or the moments of the Prophet just before his death. Did he give a wasiyyah or not? Let's take this other narration in the chapter. Sa'id ibn Jubair reports that Abdullah ibn Abbas said, Thursday. I said, what do you mean by this Thursday? Then he wept so much that it even moistened the pebbles. And he said that the pain of the Prophet took a turn for the worse. It became severe. This was near his time of death. And at that time, the Prophet said, Ituni aktub lakum kitaban la tadillu ba'di. Come, I shall write for you something by which you will not be misguided after me. That is to say, I will order somebody to write down some commands for you by which you will not go astray. So the people started to argue between themselves, and it's not fitting that people argue in front of the Prophet, says Abdullah ibn Abbas. They said, how is the Prophet? Has he lost consciousness? The Prophet said, leave me. I am in a better state. I will give you a wasiyyah of 3 things. And he said, أخرجوا المشركين من جزيرة العرب. Drive out the mushrikeen from the Arabian Peninsula. وأجيزوا الوفد بنحو ما كنت أجيزهم. And show hospitality to the delegations just as I used to show hospitality to them. And the narrator of this narration did not mention the 3rd wasiyyah because he forgot it. And so this is the narration then. We learn 2 out of the 3 matters which the Prophet gave a wasiyyah about. Remember, a wasiyyah can be a particular order to do something. The scholars have their conjecture about what the 3rd wasiyyah may have been. Some said that it would have been not to take the Prophet's grave as a place of worship. Others said that it was an order to make Osama ibn Zayd the leader of an army which the Prophet dispatched. The Prophet did make Osama the leader, but he would have wanted the people to carry out this order. But in any case, it's difficult to say for sure. The Prophet did not die on Thursday, he died on a Monday. So in fact, there were 4 days: Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then Monday. So he died on the 4th day after Thursday. And if he wanted to nominate Ali radiallahu anh as his successor, then he had enough time to do so. He even led some salawat as well in that time. So as for his first wasiyyah, أخرجوا المشركين من جزيرة العرب, this is similar to where he says, لأخرجن اليهود والنصارى من جزيرة العرب حتى لا عدع إلا مسلما. I will drive out the Jews and Christians from the Arabian Peninsula and only leave Muslims. But there is no problem for these people to come into the Jazirat al-Arab to work. But as for residency, after Allah Jalla wa Ala has purified this land from shirk, then this is not befitting. As for his second wasiyyah, the wafd, or the delegation, we know that the 9th year was the Amul Wafud, the year of the delegation, and the Prophet received many delegations embracing Islam, and the Prophet has given the wasiyyah to his companions to do the same thing when a delegation comes to embrace Islam, show them hospitality. So what about the wasiyyah for the Khilafah then? Well, we have plenty of evidence which strongly indicates that if the Prophet was to be completely direct and explicit in giving the Khilafah to anyone, that it would have been Abu Bakr, no doubt about that. He made Abu Bakr lead the prayer in his absence, for example. So he gave Abu Bakr the Khilafah in the prayer. Likewise, in the 9th year, Abu Bakr led the delegation to perform the Hajj. The Prophet could not make it because it was the Amul Wafud, as we said. He closed the doors leading to the masajid except the door of Abu Bakr. Likewise, we have the situation in the Sahih where a woman came to ask the Prophet about something, and the Prophet told her to come back, and she said that if I do not find you, then what? And he said, إِن لَمْ تَجِدِينِي فَأْتِي أَبَا بَكْرٍ. If you do not find me, then go to Abu Bakr. So even in the case of a fatwa, he made Abu Bakr the Khalifa, if you like. So we have the Salah, we have the Hajj, we have a fatwa. Also about matters of the Khilafah, the Prophet said, يَأْبَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ وَالْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِلَّا أَبَا بَكْرٍ. Allah and His Messenger and the Mu'minun would refuse everyone except Abu Bakr. Likewise, he says that he has not taken anyone as a Khalil, but if he were to do that, it would have been Abu Bakr. So after all of these evidences, how can we say that anyone other than Abu Bakr is the rightful owner of the seat of the Khalifa? Yes, it is true, he did not directly give a wasiyyah that Abu Bakr will be my Khalifa in these words or words to that effect. But the cumulative force of the evidence is so convincing that we have to say that Abu Bakr is the rightful Khalifa. Let us take this next hadith as well from Ibn Abbas. He says, when the Prophet was about to leave the world, there were people around him in the house, and Umar ibn al-Khattab was one of them. The Prophet said to the people, هَلُمَّ أَكْتُبْ لَكُمْ كِتَابًا لَا تَضِلُّوا بَعْدَهُ. Come, I will write for you something you will not be misguided after it. And to this Umar objected, saying that the pain has overcome the Prophet, and we have the Quran. It is enough for us, the Book of Allah. And so upon this the people started to dispute. Some wanted the Prophet to write down this wasiyyah, and others agreed with Umar. And when the argument became severe, the Prophet said, "Qumu, get up and go away." And Ibn Abbas used to say, there was indeed a heavy loss, meaning to say, because of this dispute, the Prophet could not write down what he wanted to write down. Now, some of the Qur'aniyun, those who only take the Qur'an and reject the Hadith, they will say, look, in this narration there is an evidence against people who take the Hadith, because Umar says that عندكم القرآن حسبنا كتاب الله. We have the Qur'an, the Book of Allah is sufficient for us. They will say, look, that's enough. Why do we need a Hadith? Why do we need Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and all the other kutub of the Sunan and others besides? But we say, no, this is wrong. The reason why Umar did not want the Prophet to write anything down is not because Umar rejects the ahadith. حاشاه من ذلك. No, Umar is far removed from such a thought. Rather, the reason why Umar did not want the Prophet to write anything down is taken from the narration itself, is because the Prophet was in pain, and Umar did not want the Prophet to undertake any more hardship. He wanted the Prophet just to be at ease and at rest, not be working, writing things down for the ummah or ordering things to be written down for the ummah. This is not the time. And then besides, during the last few days of the Prophet's life, he did not order anything new. Whatever he ordered was already established. It was just a reinforcement. So there is nothing new that the Prophet could have come up with during this particular time in this narration. So taking these 2 points into account, the first one being the pain of the Prophet, and the second one being that the Prophet is not going to write down anything new, taking this into account, Umar made his ijtihad, which is reasonable enough, that you should not trouble the Prophet. There is no way you can take from this that the ahadith should not be considered. Of course, we see that Ibn Abbas disagreed. He said this is a great calamity. But it is not really a calamity. It would be a calamity if we lost some knowledge which we didn't already have. Yes, that would be a calamity because we lose knowledge. But here, it doesn't appear that we are losing any knowledge. And so therefore it cannot be a calamity. Let's just take a few more points of benefit. The rich people can take benefit from the waqf. Remember how the waqf was dedicated to the near kindred of Umar radiallahu anh. Now they could be rich. Likewise the guest. He could be rich as well. We may also take that knowledge from the Prophet other than the Quran can be written down because the Prophet wanted to have something written down for them. As for the narration where the Prophet said do not write anything other than the Quran down, then this ruling is abrogated. It was only during the early days. Okay, let's take some review questions. So question number 1, define what a wasiyyah is linguistically and technically. Question number 2, the deceased cannot intercede for the living. Recall the evidence for this rule. Question number 3, define what a waqf is linguistically and technically.